Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CHRA webinar, Social Return on Investment, Making the Case for Housing. I'm Kristen Holinsky, Program Manager here at CHRA, and I'll be your facilitator for today's webinar. We've received an incredible amount of interest in today's webinar and have with us over 85, up to 90 now, I see, participants from across Canada. So thank you all for joining us today. Before we begin, I'll give a brief overview of the webinar technology. I'll then introduce our agenda and the speakers for this afternoon's presentation. Today's webinar is in real time. You should now be able to see a title screen of today's presentation and be able to hear me via your computer speakers, headset, or through your telephone if you've chosen to dial in. First, I want to let you know that you're all muted, and we do this to minimize background noise. If you wish to ask questions, which we highly encourage you to do throughout the webinar, you may do so by typing your questions into the dialog box on the webinar control panel at any time during the presentation. We'll address as many questions as we can both throughout the webinar and during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and please indicate to which speaker your question is being addressed. If at any point you're having technical problems, please call Vicky Coulombe-Joyce here at the office. Her contact information is available in the text box on your screen, or she can be reached at 613-594-3007, extension 19. Moving on to the agenda for today, we're thrilled to have with us Stephanie Robertson, CEO and founder of Simpact Strategy Group in Calgary, Alberta, as well as Sydney Blum, Director of Community Impact and Strategic Relations at Wood Green Community Services in Toronto, Ontario. So thank you both for being here with us today. We will hear from Stephanie to begin, followed by Sydney with concluding remarks from Stephanie. As mentioned, we'll be leaving time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. Today's webinar will focus on the how and the why of measuring the impact of social return on investment and the implications for affordable nonprofit and supportive housing providers. As organizations increasingly seek to expand their priorities beyond strictly financial objectives, today's webinar will provide more information on the value of SROI to organizations, funders, clients, and the public, along with examples highlighting the benefits of SROI as a tool for housing service providers. So without further ado, I now have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Stephanie Robertson, CEO and founder of Simpact Strategy Group. As the first accredited SROI practitioner in North America, Stephanie is a leading professional in the area of social impact measurement and management. Her project experience is intertwined across the for-profit, nonprofit, and public sectors, while her dynamic presentations vary from a general overview of both community investment in the social impact agenda to specific technical workshops on the SROI methodology. Through her career, Stephanie has led many diverse initiatives, including the creation of Generation 2000, the development of the SROI Primer Education Tool, and is a founding partner of the SROI Canada Network. So welcome, Stephanie, and over to you.
Thank you very much. What I've been asked to do is to give an overview of the methodology, then to apply the methodology in a housing context. Sydney then will step in and work her magic, and then I'll talk about some of the challenges that we face with regard to the SROI methodology in Canada, and also some exciting things that are coming to Canada in 2016. So what I'm hoping that what I'll do is to give you a brief overview and looking forward to the questions that you have to answer, for me to answer at the end of our time together. So just so you know, Simpact, a strategy group, Simpact, the word we made up over 10 years ago, social impact, that's where we get the name Simpact from. We do a lot of work in community investment. We facilitate something called LBG Canada, which some of you might have come across in your work. But on the SROI front, we do a lot of work on social value creation, actual consulting work, and also training work in SROI. So my experience in SROI started in 2001, and I really have enjoyed working with the methodology because it helps to tell the story of value that's often difficult for the program or the project to express succinctly and clearly, but also for audiences to understand. So it's the SROI methodology to me is really an approach that helps to explain the nub of the change and the value of that change to stakeholders that might be difficult for key audiences to understand. Um, One of the things I'll talk about at the end is just the need for more accredited practitioners in Canada and more methodology sharing across the country. This is just an example of some of the work that we've been involved in the last 3 or 4 years. But I am excited by all of the interest in SROI, and I'm excited by all the work that's going on in different parts of the country. Our support of the SROI Canada Methodology Hub is an attempt to try and bring that practice together so that we can create a common language to express the value of social things in Canada, even though within that common language it's very important for us to have the flexibility to express unique circumstances by sector, by region, by population group, or whatever. Anyway, we will come back to some of that later on in our time together. So an overview of the methodology. When we talk about social value creation, what do we mean and how do we measure it? Some of you may know that the SROI methodology actually started through a gentleman's work, Jed Emerson, in the early 90s. If you've never Googled Jed Emerson, it's J-E-D Emerson. He's written some very important papers, The Nature of Returns. I would highly encourage you to just get a sense of some of the thinking that led to the SROI methodology, and that was in the early 90s. It came from a really strong desire for a nonprofit, the Roberts Enterprise Development Fund, to be able to engage investors in programming rather than continue on a donor relationship, which is obviously a more traditional approach and way of thinking. I'm just going to fast forward to Great Britain, 15 years later, when there was tremendous conversation about the value of the third sector and the value of social activity as an economic engine. The SROI methodology started being used by a number of organizations at the national and local government level, and the SROI network was formed in the UK in 2009. Now, the only reason that I'm saying all this, and if you excuse me, I'm just taking a drink, is that oh shoot, I've got a block on my screen. Kirsten, can you run the show from your side so that I don't have this, my screen is not showing, but yours is? The only reason that I'm saying this is that the SROI network has been rebranded to social value. And so if you go to look for SROI internationally, sorry, I have a dry throat. I'm just going to take a sip of water.
Sorry about that. Stephanie just has a cold. She's getting a sip of water, and we'll hear back from her in just a minute. And we have the presentation now up. And Stephanie, I can run it from my end, so just let me know when you want me to change slides. Do that.
Thank you. Okay, so if you Google SROI internationally, you're actually going to find socialvalueinternational.org. And when you go to the socialvalueinternational.org, you'll see that the principles, excuse me, of social value really emphasize what happens to people, how change affects their lives, and how we can express that change in qualitative, quantitative, and comparative information. And I say that because the methodology is really advancing in terms of its practice and discipline and consistency internationally, and we're very pleased to be a part of that. You can change the slide, Kirsten. So SROI is only one approach to express the value of change that people experience in monetary terms. And sometimes I feel that the S is an Achilles heel because people think that social things cannot be expressed in dollar terms. But the methodology really encourages us to think about how to do that effectively and to think about what that value is from various stakeholder perspectives. It's very, very stakeholder driven. Can you change the slide, please? One of the things that we need to remember is that just because we can value something monetarily doesn't mean it's the only thing that's valuable. Excuse me, I'm just going to Okay, so if we actually smile at somebody, or if we actually engage someone in a conversation who otherwise wouldn't have anyone to talk to, or we enhance someone's confidence so they have the confidence to go and apply for a job, or we give them the ability to think about their future differently, we may not always be able to monetize that change. But that doesn't necessarily mean that change has no value. What we want to do is to really think about how we can document that change with an outcomes-based evaluation framework. And from the documentation of that very important change, we then take from that larger outcome map and monetize that which is possible to monetize. You can change the slide. So when we think about the SROI methodology, there's really two elements to it. One is the measurement piece, which is really important. The outcomes-based framework is the core of that measurement piece. Whether or not you're evaluating an outcome that happened in the past or thinking about the potential for an outcome to happen in the future, that outcomes-based, what has changed, who has changed, how have they changed, can we measure that change, and would there have been an alternative outcome, or what would have happened if this change did not occur? The techniques to get at that information are very closely mirrored in an outcomes-based evaluation framework. When we get to the SROI piece, what we're really looking at is, okay, we understand who changed, we understand how they changed and the importance of that change. How do we actually value that? And how do we make sure that the value that we claim in relation to the activities that we're offering, such as provision of housing, provision of skills development opportunities, provision of 24-hour care, or respite for a family in need, is 100% of that change because of us? Or do we actually need to acknowledge other influences as we go towards the steps of value creation? And I'll give you some ideas in a few minutes about how we tackle those questions. You can change the slide. So one of the things which we often hear is that people think about the SROI methodology as an evaluation tool. And I would actually explain it more effectively as a framework that gathers information, and that information is coming from a variety of different tools. So that information might come from research, or it might come from a survey that you're doing from a stakeholder, or it might come from evaluation results that you're drawing upon in the past to project value out into the future. And so I think of the SROI methodology as a framework to gather information within that really pulls upon a whole variety of different sources. The only time that I would say that an SROI is not appropriate is when an organization is actually not really able or prepared for whatever reason to think about change and outcomes, i.e. they're stuck on outputs or want to do developmental evaluation, both of which are incredibly useful in certain circumstances but don't lead you to an SROI. And you can change the slide, Kirsten. And ultimately, even though I would describe the SROI methodology as a very iterative process, so you scope out your exercise first and you identify who is the key stakeholder. You then map those outcomes, think about valuing those outcomes. You do a little bit of math, which I say lovingly and will help you to understand how that happens, and then you communicate. But it's a very, very iterative process that as you involve your stakeholders, your scope might evolve even though you're already at stage 3, or you discover an outcome that is specifically linked to an activity that you didn't anticipate, but you've now learned is very valuable because of that stakeholder consultation. So it's really meant to be a process that informs a program deliverer or a policy implementer or an organization with a very with an organization's mission. Is really supposed to help you understand, if I deliver on these activities, what changes will occur for the stakeholders that I'm trying to touch, and how do they value those changes, rather than a methodology that focuses on, did this outcome occur? I need to assess whether or not my expectations have been met. It's really meant to capture value from the human experience of actually participating in an activity and then seeing the impact of that as a result. You can change the slide. And at the end of the day, what we are really wanting to emphasize is, while it's 100% true that you're going to look at what you invested and you're going to look at the value that you create, and you're going to divide that value by the investment and get an SROI ratio, such as the one that I've explained, I've just offered up here. This SROI ratio is for 3 years of program delivery by a social enterprise in Calgary called Meticulon. Meticulon helps skilled people along the autism spectrum to find meaningful work in a whole variety of different corporations across the greater Calgary area. It's a social enterprise, and it creates value by connecting that person who would otherwise be excluded from a work opportunity to a work opportunity which they can not only do well, but also in an environment that supports them because they understand their needs as a result of their place on the autism spectrum. So at the end of the day, it's true. Meticulon has an average 3-year ratio of $2.64 created of social value, financial value, and some environmental value for every $1 invested. What we want to do is actually use that ratio as a communication bridge to really pull the audience toward the larger story of value creation, which is, how does Meticulon do that? Why are their activities effective? How do they know they're attracting the right people to their organization? Why are those job placements successful? So you can change the slide, Kirsten. Well, we always say that the SROI ratio is a key part of the story. What we really want to do is to bring people in to the story using the hook of the ratio, but not relying on that ratio to be the only thing that we say in its own right. So if we keep going, and I'm just going to give you a couple of housing examples. Next slide, please. What we really want to do is we want to think about an outcome. So what has changed for the stakeholder as a result of the activity being offered. And I'm going to show you in a second, so don't change the slide yet, Kirsten, but I'm going to show you an example of an outcome map for an organization that had significant housing outcomes. What we really want you to think about is not only what are the changes that did occur as a result of those activities, but what are the changes that also did not occur? What is the alternative outcome that would have potentially occurred if that person had not had the opportunity to access that service? So when we think about outcomes as the foundation, we want to think of them from two different perspectives. One is what did occur, and the other is what didn't, what was avoided, or what was the potential alternate outcome. Partially because that story is important to tell, but even more importantly because when we think about how to value that change, sometimes the alternative outcome actually results in a very key insight into how to value the outcome that actually did occur. So the alternative outcome can be an important source of a financial proxy. If you can take the next slide, Kirsten. So this is actually an outcome map. It's a real outcome map of an organization called First Steps. And, First Steps it could apply to, but it's also Human House in Toronto. So this is actually the stakeholder here who has experienced change is a pregnant and parenting woman between the ages of 16 to 29, and she has the reality of mental health, addictions, has potentially experienced abuse, and she definitely has housing and financial issues. So you can see, and again, this is a snapshot of an outcome map. It's a more extensive, there's multiple lines. This is just an example. But you can see what we're trying to do is to link the activity that's been offered to the outcome that has been achieved. So by providing secure housing and supports, she's got increased stability and because she has a secure place to live, but also has decreased her risk of being impacted by domestic violence. And the thing which I think is really interesting about looking at it from this perspective is that it is impossible to address the other outcomes that she has experienced in the absence of the connection to secure housing. So one of the things that we find in a lot of the work that we do, and all of the work that we do, is that it really helps the organization to start thinking much more horizontally about the connection between the service or one activity that's being provided and the person's ability to maintain that outcome into the future. And you'll see, as you start thinking about SROI in your own work, those ripple effects will become more apparent. So you can change the slide, please.
Just as Stephanie takes a break to clear her throat, I've been getting some questions about whether or not the presentation will be available after the webinar. And just to let you all know that both the recording and each of Stephanie and Sydney's PowerPoints will be made available in the next few days on the CHRA website. So you will be able to find that at www.chra-achru.ca/webinars. And so you'll be able to find the presentations there. And have access to Stephanie and Sydney's slides. So hopefully, Stephanie, you're feeling okay and back on track.
Yes. I'm so sorry. I was completely fine 5 minutes before we started. So anyway, First Steps in New Brunswick. Providing housing and support for mothers fleeing violence. You can see Outcomes for mothers are very important in terms of their housing stability, but it leads to very important other outcomes. It enables them to address substance abuse issues, financial stability, etc., etc. And in the course of meeting those objectives, the outcomes for government are achieved. And this SROI methodology really helps to illustrate how that link occurs. You can change the slide, please. Another example, this is from Newfoundland. This project actually is really focused on helping people who are only able to work for minimum periods to access. But one of the key outcomes for them in the course of being able to access that work is to maintain their housing stability. So you can see how it's all connected. You can change the slide, please. Another SROI focused on teen moms. Again, housing issues being addressed, but in the course of doing so, strengthening the family and enabling their children to access better services that help their developmental stages. You can change the slide, please. Downtown outreach program in Calgary really works with people who are very, very far down the spectrum of homelessness, have an addiction issue, but they meet people where they're at without judgment, helping them to access shelter, which is obviously short-term initially, but some of them becomes much more long-term, experiencing a whole wide range of outcomes, not only across the spectrum for the participant, but also you can see that government is able to experience value creation through this whole notion of cost reallocation. So services are allocated more effectively and differently as a result of the DOPE team's work. You can change the slide, please. And finally here, diversity, which is a mental health and addictions, a mental health program that really works with ex-offenders who've been released from prison and because of their mental health issues find themselves in vulnerable circumstances. Again, what Diversity does is actually enable them to access secure housing, which then through that secure housing leads to better mental health outcome, increased opportunity to work. You can actually see how the methodology really helps the organization to think much more horizontally about the value of its work and how it's touching stakeholders. You can change the slide, please. So let's just keep going. One more slide, please. So when we think about value, how is it different than cost? And this is what SROI Canada is, the methodology hub is really trying to get moving in terms of thinking in Canada. You know, if we went to buy a house, we would never purchase that house based on how many nails, how much the nails cost, how much the tiling was, and how much the roof cost. We would never have that opportunity. We would purchase that house, or our cars, or our shoes, or our children's private school education, if that's what we choose to do. We would value the context and many other important pieces of information that would move what we would choose to pay from the pricing point to, or the cost point, excuse me, to the value of what we see. And if the SROI methodology is trying to enable us to have a conversation when it comes to investment in society and environmental aspects in order to think about value in much broader terms, but in a similar way to how we value other things that we are accustomed to deciding about in our lives. So you can go to the next slide. Sometimes it's really easy to value change. I did not have a job before. I have a job now. My financial proxy is the value of the wage that I now earn. But I do need to take into account if I had a subsidy before and I'm now no longer taking that subsidy, that value, the subsidy is government value, government stakeholder reallocated investment. My subsidy was $100 a month. Now I'm earning $150 a month. That $50 is my financial proxy. Very straightforward, very direct. It would be great if all of the financial proxies that we used were that easy to assign. But unfortunately, many of the values that we're trying to express, many of the changes that we're trying to express the values of are not universally agreed. So if I am offering a teacher an opportunity to enhance her skills through the Chevron Open Minds program here in Calgary, which is all about experiential learning, or I'm in St. John, New Brunswick, and I'm offering people to learn how to communicate, be on time, and include essential soft skills into my training so that I'm more likely to be able to maintain my employment. That's what WorkLinks does. That the value of those two things is not universally agreed. And so when it's not universally agreed, we need to go and find financial proxies to represent that value. So when we think about financial proxies, we've got to think about the outcomes achieved, the value of avoiding the alternative, and think about it from a stakeholder's perspective. So if you change the slide, there's different types of cost of value creation, and I'm just going to go through this very quickly, but I'm happy to discuss it at later on. Cost reallocation and cost savings are two types of value creation that often get confused. We find people talk about cost savings, but actually what we're really talking about is reallocating resources to somebody else who would either have had to wait in line or would not have been able to access that resource at all. So if I'm enabling someone to be housed securely and stably rather than having them live on the street, what I'm doing is I'm enabling the EMS or the emergency or the police services that otherwise would have had to interact with that person on a daily or weekly basis to be reallocated to other situations in need. And that is value that very rarely gets acknowledged in the course of our day-to-day work because everyone's looking for cost savings. And while cost savings are fantastic when we can actually develop them or achieve them, cost reallocation, I think, is incredibly important to acknowledge because it's a sign of more effective service delivery. There's other types of value creation, future cost avoidance, increased income. The two major ones are always going to be cost reallocation and cost savings. The other four happen frequently, but not as frequently as those two things. So if we go to the next slide, Kirsten, and then we'll finish off and pass the baton over to the wood green example. So this is an example of how we might apply financial proxies to a particular housing circumstance and some of the other outcomes that the stakeholders have experienced as a result of them being more stably housed. So in this instance, the woman is becoming increasingly stable. She's got increased stability in her housing and she's less likely to be homeless. And so what we decided is that we really needed to find a way to represent the value of that stability. And what we know is that if people are required to move frequently or they're at risk in losing their apartments, there's a cost associated to that. Sometimes they have to leave their goods behind. Sometimes they lose their rent deposits, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the financial proxies that we assigned to outcomes here was the value of not having to lose that money, deposit furniture, whatever you have to leave behind. That's where that financial proxy came from. There's also the opportunity you need to store your goods potentially, so there's another value there because you don't have to have that expense. The other thing about this particular population is that when they're on the streets, they're at incredibly high risk of sexual assault. And so the financial proxy that's represented there is really trying to reflect the avoidance of pain and suffering because they're no longer at that risk. Now, we're going to keep moving. We can come back to more questions about financial proxies, but there are some examples for people to consider. And again, the slides will be made available, and I'm happy to answer any questions later. So should we just go to the next slide, Kirsten? And there's two more, and then we pass over to Sydney. So in SROI terms, there's a really important difference between an outcome and an impact. An outcome is the big change. So all the kids graduated high school. That is fantastic. The difference between an outcome and an impact in an SROI world is that an outcome is, okay, all the kids graduated high school. An impact is, was that whole graduating class all because of me? Was it all because of my activity that these young children ended up, or these high school students ended up graduating? And oftentimes, the answer is no. And so the difference between outcome and impact is when we ask ourselves the questions, how long did the change last? Would anyone have got there without us? Were there any unintended consequences? Does work from another organization need to be acknowledged, and will that change drop off over time? And if you change into the next slide, this is just a visual representation. It's a little bit detailed for this particular conversation, but the main point being, you still have that same stakeholder, you still have the outcome, you still have the indicator that we're talking about, and the financial proxy, and then there's a process that you need to work through in order to ensure that the value that you are linking to your impact does not be at risk of overstating the circumstances. And at the end of the day, you will get a ratio, but in my experience, what you really want to do is to use that ratio to bring attention to how those changes are occurring and why the organization is enabling those changes to occur successfully. We can come back, but why don't we pass over to Sydney from here?
Thanks so much, Stephanie, and thank you for fighting through your cold and being a trooper about it. I'm now going to flip our presentation deck over to Sydney so that she can speak with us on the wood green example. So Sydney, I'm flipping the presentation over to you. And I'll as we're setting up, and I'll introduce Sydney. Sydney Blum, Director of Community Impact and Strategic Relations at Wood Green Community Service. Sydney's portfolio includes the replication of Wood Green's award-winning Homeward Bound program, the Urban Aboriginal Homeward Bound Feasibility Project, and Wood Green's SROI, along with partnership and program development across the GTA. Sydney has a BA in Sociology from the University of Chicago and her Master's in Science and Ecological Economics from the University of Edinburgh. So, Sydney, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here today, and I'm so excited to be connected with everyone who's participating in this webinar, both in real time and those listening back on it in the future. And even just hearing everything Stephanie has just shared, it just reminds me of how much I appreciate SROI as a tool, and how much I would encourage those of you that are listening that are interested to really seek out more information so that you can continue to learn about this tool, because I feel like we're just hitting the tip of the iceberg, and I can imagine that this will have so much application to the various different organizations that are tuning in. So just to give you a little overview, I'm going to talk a little bit just to introduce Wood Green for context and give you a brief overview of what Homeward Bound is, because that is the program that we have been using for our SROI work. I'll tell you about our program outcomes and results, an analysis that BCG did looking at the first cohort of Homeward Bound participants, and then I will also be I'm talking about the work that I've been doing in terms of really expanding our SROI practice and creating resources that we can use to support our partner communities. So just really briefly, because I know we have folks from across the country here today, Woodgreen is based in Toronto, and we are a multi-service social services agency and an affordable housing provider. And we've been around for a very long time. We have 36 locations and serve 37,000 people each year. I'm going to keep moving because I really would like to spend our time together talking about SROI. But just as a brief background, Homeward Bound is one of 75 different programs and services that Woodgreen offers. It's unique because it's a program that pairs our housing services with wraparound coordinated supports for participants in Homeward Bound. And I am a huge proponent, especially for those housing providers that are listening. I think we all know what it means to be serving clients that have great needs or who may be facing barriers. And I would really, really advocate that a very strong way forward is to look at how we can coordinate services and supports to really enable our clients and our tenants to continue to be safely and stably housed. Homeward Bound as a program is an interesting example. It launched in 2004, but it was really sparked in the late 1990s when the City of Toronto and service providers and shelters identified more than 2,000 children living in Toronto's shelter system. And at that time, there was a widespread recognition that something needed to be done, and were there different ways that service providers and housing providers could meet the needs of families who were struggling. And so Homeward Bound came out of that, and it's a program for precariously housed and homeless single mothers who have children under the age of 18. And although it's a program that has housing built in, and in fact the program provides 4 years of housing, so it goes beyond being a transitional housing program, but really provides that extensive 4-year period of housing so that the women who participate in the program can become self-sufficient at the end. And so as you'll see in this model that I have showing, phase 1 of Homeward Bound, really just to step back for a second, this really is an education and employment program as well. And so we do academic assessment as part of our intake because we have a set period of time with our participants. We want to have them being within about 6 months of college readiness when they start Homeward Bound. And then when the families move into the program, phase 1 includes life skills training, computer skills, financial empowerment workshops, as well as a lot of employment preparation and pre-college workshops around scholarship preparation and other pieces to really help the participants in the program reach a place of readiness to embark on 2-year college diplomas. And we also have counseling as a part of the program as well. Women then do a 2-year college diploma program in a program that meets the immediate needs of the labor market. And so in Toronto, our participants undertake diplomas in a range of different business programs, IT, paralegal and law clerk, and early childhood education. But as we are now working with 8 currently partner communities that are replicating Homeward Bound and looking at the model, each community is really analyzing their local context and their local labor market to ensure that the educational programs that the women participate in really will equip the participants to become employed at least a living wage in their own community. Phase 3 of Homeward Bound is an internship. We've actually just added in a workshop as well called Transitions to Success that is an employability piece. So the women learn a lot of soft skills and get to practice scenarios and role playing to prepare for interviews and in the workplace. And finally, the goal is that the women are then employed by year 4 in Homeward Bound. So there is a job search phase of the program. Some women receive offers of employment immediately following their internships. Others do a job search which our staff and employment services support. But the goal of Homeward Bound is that through this 4-year experience, the women in the program do become economically self-sufficient. So that is the ultimate outcome of the program. That is the big change that happens. And about 80% of the women who have entered Homeward Bound and who have graduated have either maintained their employment or are meeting their milestones in the program. And I'm keep moving because I want to get onto the SROI. But Excuse me, and I'm having water too. So initially, in 2013, Boston Consulting Group did an analysis where they looked at the very first cohort of homeward bound participants. And I just want to highlight that the group that they looked at were actually, I would say, our guinea pigs. It was the women who were in the first cohort of homeward bound that was actually the cohort that informed a lot of program improvements. But BCG conducted their analysis and found that for every dollar invested in homeward bound, there was a $4 return to society. Excuse me. So that was the SROI ratio. But the number that I found really, really interesting is the bullet point, at the bottom of the slide, which is that for program graduates who get their college diploma or college degree, um, they they will ultimately generate a cumulative benefit for themselves and their children of just under $300,000 in their lifetime. So in terms of a quantifiable impact, that's a very powerful number. And the work that we did with BCG was interesting and really sparked this interest within Wood Green to ask ourselves, well, this is great information to have. Of course, any any community service provider or nonprofit organization really values this kind of quantifiable value that we could use for communication to promote our programs and services. But is there a way that we could really build an SROI methodology into the way that we measure data within the program, into the way that we evaluate and track our outcomes? And so that really sparked the beginning of a deeper interest within Wood Green in terms of wanting to build capacity around SROI, to do in-house analysis, and to also support our partners. So sometime, I'm thinking it was about 2 years ago, I actually participated in the Phase 1 Practitioner Accreditation, which is a training that SROI Canada puts on. And as you may recall, Stephanie, who you're hearing from today, is one of the founders of SROI Canada. And she was actually the person who led the training that I did, and it was really, really excellent. So if her introduction today is really growing your interest in this field, I would strongly encourage you to look at participating in that training. And when I did that training, it was with a very diverse group of participants. We had, everyone from evaluators to executive directors and board members to academic folks participating in the training, and I think that just speaks to the breadth of application of SROI. And so just to come back to the Homeward Bound program, over the last 4 years, we've built relationships with partner communities. So for example, a scaled down Homeward Bound replication has launched in Halton over a year ago, and we're working with community partners in Peterborough and Brockville that are also developing their own Homeward Bound replications. Another piece of the work that we've been doing is partnering with the Ontario Federation of Indigenous Friendship Centres and 5 Friendship Centre communities, who initially the project was to really do a feasibility study looking at Homeward Bound and adapting the model for the urban Indigenous context. But what's arisen through that work is that we actually have partner communities that are now moving forward in actually developing plans for urban Aboriginal Homeward Bounds. And I think of Dryden in particular, that's already looking at moving forward with an implementation plan. How does all of this tie back to SROI? Well, Homeward Bound is in a way perhaps the most complicated program we could have chosen to try to analyze through the SROI tool. Any one piece of it could, in and of itself, be you could conduct an analysis on the education piece or on the impact of the coordinated supports through Wood Green. But I think finding a way to tell this bigger picture story about what changes for the families in the program and how all of these different supports really do contribute to an increased impact and an increased value, not just for the families who participate in the program and, women who go on to be employed, who are able to pay market rent for their housing when they used to be, living in RGI housing or even living in shelters or, couch surfing, or for their children who are now pursuing post-secondary education when that might have never been a conversation previously. But I think beyond those participants, being able to tell the story through SROI lens is really helpful for our funders. It's really helpful for our government partners, and for our other partners that are contributing to this program, which especially in our replication and urban Aboriginal communities, all of those communities are looking at a highly collaborative program model. So unlike Wood Green, who in Toronto is able to deliver a lot of those components of Homeward Bound, I think in communities that have collaborative programs, SROI is a very interesting tool to tell the story that everyone is woven into as part of the fabric of a coordinated response. So I know I've been talking quickly because I really wanted to share as much as I possibly could. But I'm just going to flip to my next slide, which I just thought I would come back to that SROI workbook that Stephanie referenced to just give a couple of examples, because what I've really done within Wood Green is develop an SROI forecast framework that could predict the value that would be created through a Homeward Bound program. What we're going to do with our partner communities is actually work with them to develop customized SROI forecasts so that even as they're just in that program development stage, they can begin to tell the story about the value that their program will be creating. And so Homeward Bound has many outcomes throughout each of the milestones of the program, but some of the very concrete outcomes, for example, are that participants have stable housing, that there's a greater probability of post-secondary education for their children, and that through that methodology, we are able to find financial proxies, which is, the value of an affordable apartment, or there's actually research out there that values the cost to the larger system when a student drops out of high school. And that particular financial proxy is one that I found through the SROI Canada Financial Proxy Database. And Stephanie may be able to come back to that. But I just want to highlight that database as a tool for any of you that are listening that are already conducting SROIs. That database is really helpful. And to my knowledge, you would all be able to access that. I think you just create a user login and you can look at this. It's really meant to be a place where practitioners in the field can contribute the financial proxies that they're finding so that we can create a stronger community of practice. And that's really why Wood Green decided to jump into the SROI game, because we see the value in participating in an internationally standardized methodology, although the tool is used by many different folks, to be able to all be speaking the same language and working through those standardized steps of SROI and knowing that there is accreditation and a process to that was very attractive to us. So I'm going to stop there. I know we're probably running out of time, but thank you so much for listening, and certainly my email is in the PowerPoint for anyone who wants to reach out to me with any questions if we're not able to get to them all today. Thanks again.
Thanks so much, Sydney, for that. We're going to flip back over to Stephanie. I believe you wanted to give some concluding remarks. So I'll pull up your PowerPoint here, Stephanie, and we can carry forward.
Okay, I'd love to have some time for questions, so just really very quickly. I think that some of the challenges that we're facing, and Kirsten, will you pull up my slides again? Thank you. Challenges to SROI in Canada. I think one of the things that we're seeing is that there's a lot of individual subject matter activity, and what we need to do is to convene people around common thematic areas. So, for example, in Alberta, we've just finished some work that actually looked at 88 different projects focused on crime prevention and crime reduction. From a housing perspective, if people were going to want to look at SROI, is there a convener of some sort who could help share outcomes and share financial proxies so that people are able to express the uniquenesses of their work, but also build off the thinking that's already gone on. I'll come back to the financial proxy issue which Sydney raised, which is great. But for me, we really need to think about how we share knowledge so that there's a common building practice of how we think about social value and how we value the things that we're thinking about, despite the fact that there's a tremendous diversity in subject matter, regional realities, population groups, or whatever. there's a real need for transparency. So the work that we're working through with Wood Green is just based on a format that allows complete transparency of the thinking. And one of the things from a methodology perspective is if we really want to share the stories of value, we need to be able to share the detail of how the value was come to in order to make sure that we have opportunities to disagree with each other, frankly, or learn from each other even more importantly. So that transparency is something that is a huge focus of SROI Canada, as well as training and accreditation practitioners. And you can change the next slide. And the one thing which is just illustrated here really quickly is this is actually from the Safe Communities 88 projects that I mentioned here in Alberta. But you'll see when we started looking at outcomes and financial proxies used to demonstrate the value of changes related to crime or changes related to substance abuse or changes related to housing stability, you can actually see that when you start sharing information, you can have greater consistency in the message that you're trying to send where it's appropriate, and then focus on the uniquenesses. But why not share the learning, which is a huge priority of SROI Canada and something that I would encourage all practitioners to contribute to, because you could learn from it at the same time. So you contribute to it, but what can you get back? In the next slide, I don't want to give the impression that the valuation piece is easy. I don't think it is, doesn't need to be onerously difficult. It just needs to be thoughtful. And as we find in the, mainstream world in terms of how you value, what you buy at the grocery store versus new clothes or new products coming to market, a lot of the methodologies that have been used for some time revealed preferences. These are very well documented and very accessible, and that this is how we choose financial proxies. They do also have inherent biases, because when you go to the stakeholder to say how much do you value this, I don't know about you, but I don't always say the highest price because I'm not sure that I want to pay the highest price. So there's inherent biases that we need to get beyond when we think about how we value things, and that's why, if you change the next slide, Kirsten, the SROI Canada Financial Proxy Database has been made available as a resource, and there's quite a lot of information there, although there's a real opportunity to contribute more information as it's discovered. And if you just flip to the next slide, this is just an image of the proxy database. It's actually organized by theme. Every theme has a code. The code is described, as are the proxy and the source, so that if you wanted to use it in one of your studies, it would be very easy to go back to the source and really explain why you chose it, and also know that it has been reviewed prior to being put on the database. So there's a degree of credibility associated with that, even though it's still up to the practitioner to choose how it's going to be used. But finally, the last thing I wanted to bring your attention to is that in the UK, there's an organization called HACT, which is a housing association, which many of you might actually already be aware of. One of the things which they realized is that there's, in some instances, people are able to go and talk to stakeholders, and that is incredibly valuable. And those stakeholders will really help inform the choice of financial proxies. In other instances, it's actually not always possible to do that. So can you use census data and well-being indices, like the Canadian Index of Well-being, to actually start creating a proxy database or a financial proxy database that would help to inform the value of change around a variety of things: housing, crime prevention, education, employment. HACT has actually worked with Daniel Fujiwara to create a database that you can access through subscription to get valuations that will inform your SROI work. And Daniel is going to be working with SROI Canada and a number of other partners to create a Canadian version of this hack database, which shall be launched in 2016, sometime in the second half of the year. And while you will be able to get at it organizationally directly through this Canadian database, you could also get at it as an individual practitioner through the SROI Canada network. And I really think that that will be helpful in helping us to communicate value in a way that is more easily understood by some of the audiences that we're trying to communicate with, be them corporate, public sector, or whomever. So I'm quite excited about that, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Probably the best way to stay posted on that would be to sign up for the the SROI Canada proxy database, and that would link you to a news source that will keep you posted not only on the existing proxy database, which we just saw and Sydney mentioned, but also that which will be enhanced by this new statistical well-being StatsCan tool that we'll be creating in partnership with Daniel. So I think we have time for questions if there are any. And thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. This is Kristen for your presentation. Thank you to Sydney. While you were just wrapping up, Stephanie, we had Sydney drop us a line saying she just got pulled out to an emergency at work, so she was no longer on the line, but we do still have Stephanie here, and we do still have 5 or 10 minutes to take some questions. So I really do encourage those who are still on the line, the majority of whom have stayed on. If you have any questions for Stephanie, please do bring them forward, and we can take a few minutes to follow up with her. Just to repeat, because we have some more questions about accessing the presentation. Yes, you will be able to access the slides as well as a recording of the presentation. That will be available by early next week on the CHRA website. And so you can access that at www.chra-achru.ca/webinars. And that's where you will be able to find the presentations. You'll also be able to find more information on upcoming webinars. So we have some people writing in saying thank you very much for this presentation. We still have a lot of people on the line, so a lot of interest here. So Stephanie, we'll start with a question here. We have a couple in the line for you. You've mentioned that it's important with the SROI methodology to at some points recognize other partners and those who are involved as well in contributing to the impact outcomes that your organization might be representing. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that with an example, either through a affordable housing provider or another group that you've worked with.
Okay, so probably the easiest example that I have, we did some work with the YWCA here a number of years ago, Mary Dover House, which is a transition house for women who are leaving circumstances of domestic violence. Some of them have children, some of them do not. At the end of the day, they realized that all of their client base was also accessing services of two other organizations, the Victorian Order of Nurses and the Calgary Urban Project Society, to access different programs. This access was coming out of a completely different budget. So while they had clients in common and they were coordinated to a degree, the fact that the Mary Dover House clients were able to hold on to and successfully maintain their outcomes was influenced by their interactions with these other two organizations. And so at the end of the day, when they looked at the value being created through their investment in certain activities, they divided that end value by 3, because they realized that none of those outcomes would have likely been maintained or potentially have been achieved at all if the person's journey toward achieving that outcome hadn't also be influenced by these two other organizations. Another great example would be, high school students graduating math. Was it all because of the teacher? Well, possibly yes, but in all likelihood, they were also doing an after-school math tutoring program. So we need to attribute some of the value of their ability to now graduate from high school to both the math program during school and the tutoring program after school. That's what we try to make sure that we acknowledge. Yeah.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful to hear. A few more questions rolling in. Next one is, in your experience, are SROI case studies used mainly for advocacy by nonprofits towards funders, or is it starting to shift to influencing organizations' own budgets and priorities?
That's a great question. I think that there's an SROI can significantly influence how organizations understand their own effectiveness. And so we see organizations actually using SROI at the end of the day, certainly the end result to communicate with funders or whomever, but the process of going through an SROI can really help you see whether or not the activities that you are offering in the anticipation of achieving outcomes are actually as effective as you'd like them to be. And if they're not, then there's an opportunity to address that. And if they are, then you have an opportunity to understand why. So I wouldn't say that the methodology is being used sort of in a very, line in the sand kind of way in terms of budgeting and priorities. But I would say it is being used to inform effectiveness, and effectiveness then informs budgeting and priorities, because it really helps the organization to see whether or not it's doing as much as it hopes to with the money that it has. And I think one of the realities is that ratios, like any indicator, are ideally used for comparison purposes. But it's actually really hard to compare, for example, a youth program to a motherhood program, because they're so different. The context around them and the value that they create is actually not really comparable. It is, and so I think those comparison ratios are much more helpful year on year, or similar practice to similar practice, because then you can say, my organization and your organization, we're both doing youth and motherhood programs, but your organization is clearly more effective doing motherhood programs than us. We're much better at youth. Let's specialize. Or how do we improve our effectiveness so that we're creating as much value as possible? Sorry, I just had to cough there for a second, but yeah.
Great, thanks so much, Stephanie. We have a question coming in from Manitoba Housing, and they're asking, they say, hi, I'm wondering how far into the future it's reasonable to project returns and attribute it to the housing investment. Over a longer period of time, I expect the link to investment and return gets weaker. Am I right?
You're definitely right. And we would also, one of the differences between outcome and impact is that whole notion of drop-off. So you definitely want to acknowledge that your influence on maintaining that outcome does weaken over time. But in terms of a reasonable projection outward, I think that varies case study to case study. In some case studies that we've done, we actually don't project any value outward because we don't know what the circumstances of that individual might be. In other instances, the SROI guide really gets you to start thinking about 5 years as a benchmark to really check yourself and say, okay, really, truly, this outcome could be maintained into the future indefinitely, but after 5 years, how influential have we really been? So it depends case study to case study. The guidance that we're provided by the International Network recommends a hard stop at, no, not a hard stop, real consideration at 5 years. so that you essentially look at that. But there are programs that you can invest in young men when they're children in grade 2, and the value, I'm thinking of the SNAP program, Stop Now and Plan, that real value doesn't kick in until they're 16. So it's more about being transparent about how you did your SROI and the judgments that the informed judgments that you make around time frame than it is to stick to a hard and fast rule. And that's one of the reasons why that whole transparency piece is so essential, so that we can really learn from each other's thinking.
Thanks for that, Stephanie. We just have a few more questions for you coming in. We do have a comment from someone who's joining us actually from the Netherlands who just wants to confirm that Hacked in the UK really is a great resource if anyone's interested in checking them out. So in the slides, Stephanie provided the website, but just to reiterate, it's www.hacked.org.uk/impact. So that's a great resource if those of you on the line are interested. We had a question, Stephanie, if SROI Canada is involved in Quebec. Are you able to speak to that?
Absolutely. I mean, SROI Canada really responds to interest wherever it is. And so there are a couple of people within our network that are from Quebec. I wouldn't say that it's as active as it might be, but it is, I mean, we'll respond to people's desire to be active. So, absolutely.
And there's also a question about whether local governments have used the SROI proxies.
Yes, so Region of Waterloo has, the City of Calgary definitely has, City of Edmonton, Lethbridge, those are the ones, Regina, I believe. So a number of local governments have used SROI. Peel Region actually invested in a lot of training in the last little while, so I think there's real interest there. I do think that that's actually, when a government of any size, local government in this instance, expresses interest, there's a real opportunity to convene the resources inside the local government to help establish proxies that are relevant at that level. I'm a really big believer that we need to convene conversations at different levels so that the proxies that are being used are universally applicable, but also locally appropriate. And certainly the network can help people connect locally, but I would encourage that conversation to happen wherever it lands. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much, Stephanie. So this is obviously just the beginning of a much larger conversation and a lot more work to be done in Canada to connect the sector and to bring the standardization and methodology to all those who are using it across Canada. So that's all the time we have for today. I really want to thank our presenters, both Stephanie Robertson from SIMPAC Strategy Group and Sydney Blum of Wood Green Community Services. The time that you've took to invest in this webinar and in preparing for it, we really thank you very, very much at CHRA and really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for participating from across Canada and even internationally. So we were really glad to have you online today. As said, you will be able to find this information on the CHRA website. And just to let you know that our next webinar will be February 17th, and on that webinar, we'll be joined by Don McBain, Executive Director of Ontario Aboriginal Housing Services, and Kevin Albers, CEO of Macola Development Services in BC, and they'll explore the implications of the Liberal government's social infrastructure pledge and what it could mean to affordable housing providers. So more information on that webinar will be coming to you very soon. Thank you all, and goodbye for now. Take care.